The independent autopsy results for 18-year-old Nolan Wells have been released, and the very first detail in that report, before any conclusion was offered, before any finding was named, was something no parent should ever have to hear about their own child. Something was missing. A piece of evidence that should have been present at the start of the examination simply was not there. It had never been sent. For a family already living inside 6 weeks of unanswered questions, that opening line changed the entire shape of this case. This is what the report found. This is what it could not find. And this is why the question of what happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island on the 4th of July remains, officially and completely, unresolved. To understand why that first missing detail carries the weight it does, you have to go back to the moment this family decided they needed a second examination at all. On July 6th, a park ranger found Nolan's body in the water off the northwestern tip of Horn Island. Within hours, before toxicology, before a completed timeline, before nearly anything had actually been established, Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter stood in front of reporters and offered the public an early explanation. He described it, in essence, as an accident. Nothing, he suggested, to indicate otherwise. For Nolan's mother, Christine, and his father, Elmore, that early explanation did not feel like reassurance. It felt like a door closing on their son's story before it had ever been properly opened. It felt like being told, gently but firmly, that there was nothing more to ask, nothing more to look for, nothing more to fight for. They did not accept that. 6 days after Nolan disappeared, while still in the most painful stretch of their lives, while trying to plan a funeral for their 18-year-old son, this family made arrangements to have his body examined again. Not because they were chasing a different answer, because they needed a complete one. This was not a simple procedural choice. This was a family actively deciding to delay saying goodbye, to prolong an already unbearable process, because something inside them refused to accept an explanation that had arrived faster than the truth ever could have. The person they chose for that second examination was Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist with more than 20 years of experience. A man who had once served as chief medical examiner for an entire major American city, overseeing thousands of cases long before this one ever reached his table. He had no ties to Mississippi, no relationship with any official involved in the case, nothing to gain by leaning in any particular direction. His task was not to confirm what the family suspected, and it was not to confirm what officials had already said publicly. His task was to examine what remained and report only what the evidence in front of him could genuinely support. What he found did not offer the family the closure they may have quietly hoped for. It handed them something far more complicated, a case that refused entirely to close. Right there, at the very opening of his written findings, was the detail that has now become the center of this entire story. Before Dr. Mitchell could even begin his own examination, he noted that certain evidence expected to arrive with Nolan's body simply had not. Material that is present under ordinary circumstances during any thorough second examination was missing entirely. It had never been sent. According to the report, that material had been retained during the very first examination, the one conducted by the state before Nolan's body was ever released back to his family. Dr. Mitchell noted in his report that this type of retention is not unheard of. It happens in cases. It is considered standard procedure while an initial examiner completes further review. But knowing why something might be missing does not undo the fact that it is missing. And its absence at the very outset of the report meant that an entire category of critical questions could not be examined at all. Not because Dr. Mitchell lacked the skill or the diligence to look, because there was simply nothing left in front of him to look at. A gap where an answer should have been, present before the examination even truly began. That single missing piece opened the door to everything else the report would go on to reveal, because once that gap was acknowledged, Dr. Mitchell's official classification followed, and it carried its own weight entirely. Cause and manner of death. Undetermined pending investigation. It is worth pausing on that word because it is easy to let it slide past without truly absorbing what it means. Undetermined does not mean nothing happened. It does not mean there is nothing left to find. It means that as of this examination, with the evidence available, there was not yet enough information to say with any certainty what took place in Nolan's final hours. For a family that had been given an explanation within a single hour of their son being found, an explanation that pointed firmly toward a simple accident. That one word carried enormous significance. It was the first official acknowledgement that the story the public had been handed was not the whole story. It quietly reopened a door that had been closed before anyone had truly had the chance to look inside it. And then came a second finding, one that no one in that room was fully prepared to hear. During his examination, Dr. Mitchell identified an area at the back of Nolan's head that he could not explain. There was no fracture beneath it, nothing that pointed clearly toward an accident, nothing that pointed clearly toward anything else. Simply a mark with no obvious origin, the kind of detail a careful, experienced pathologist cannot dismiss and cannot fully explain. In his written report, Dr. Mitchell chose his language with visible restraint. He did not call it evidence of harm. He did not call it proof of anything at all. What he did say was that it was significant enough to be highlighted for further investigation. A deliberate phrase from a man who had spent an entire career learning exactly how much and how little a body left behind can honestly tell you. For a case already defined by unanswered questions, even a cautious finding like this one was enough to shift the national conversation. Because for the first time since Nolan disappeared, there was something concrete, something documented in writing by a credentialed, independent expert, something that could no longer be dismissed as speculation, rumor, or grief, searching desperately for somewhere to place itself. 3 findings together told a story that no early press conference had prepared anyone for. An official classification that offered no closure, a missing piece of evidence that closed off entire lines of inquiry before they could even begin, and an unexplained mark that no one, not even the most experienced pathologist in the room, could confidently account for. For a family that had spent weeks demanding nothing but honesty, this was not the ending they had hoped for. It was quiet, unresolved proof that the truth was still out there somewhere. Still incomplete, still worth fighting for, no matter how long that fight might take. To understand why this case grew from a local tragedy into a story followed across the entire country, you have to go back to those very first hours after Nolan was found. Because what was said in that early window, before any real investigation had even begun, is where so much of this family's distrust was first planted. Some details from that day have never sat right no matter how many times they have been examined. Nolan went out onto the water that morning with a group of friends. By every account given afterward, he did not return with them, and neither did his phone. The explanation offered was that he had chosen to stay behind a little longer before eventually finding his own way back to shore. But that explanation left behind a question that has never been fully answered. If an 18-year-old was simply staying behind for a while, why would he leave without the one device capable of keeping him connected to the people who loved him? Why walk away from the very thing that could tell his family exactly where he was, exactly who he was with, exactly what was happening around him if anything ever went wrong? It is a small detail on the surface, but in cases like this one, it is so often the smallest details where the real story quietly waits to be noticed. For Christine, these were precisely the kinds of questions she wanted asked and genuinely answered before anyone attached a final explanation to what happened to her son. Instead, she found herself face to face with a conclusion that already felt settled, arriving before she had even been given space to process her own grief, let alone begin the task of planning her son's funeral. She asked investigators for one thing. She said, "Treat this case the way you would treat it if it were your own child. Give it the same urgency, the same scrutiny, the same refusal to look away simply because from the outside, the story seemed easy to explain. There is something deeply painful about a mother having to ask for that, having to publicly request that her son's death be taken seriously, having to advocate loudly and repeatedly while still in the earliest and rawest stages of grief, simply to be heard by the people whose job it was to help her. That request, a mother asking plainly to be believed, is what ultimately helped carry this story onto a national stage. The NAACP stood beside the family at their national convention. NAACP President Derek Johnson addressed the moment directly in front of a room full of people gathered specifically to hear it. He spoke to a pattern the organization has witnessed too many times across too many years. Cases involving young Black lives, he said, are too often allowed to close before they are properly opened. The narrative settled before all the facts have been gathered, before every witness has been questioned, before every possibility has been genuinely explored. And this case does not stand alone. It is now the third time in recent months that a young black man has died while spending time among an otherwise white group of friends, only for the very first version of events, offered within hours of the discovery, to later fall apart under closer scrutiny. Each case carries its own specific circumstances, but the pattern connecting them has become impossible for many people to ignore. For Nolan's family, none of this has ever been about assuming guilt before proof exists. Ben Crump, representing the family, has been careful to draw that distinction publicly more than once. They are not asking for a predetermined outcome. They are not asking for anyone to be presumed responsible without real evidence. What they are asking for is far simpler and far harder to argue against. A full, fair, and transparent investigation. One where every witness is questioned with equal seriousness. One where every piece of evidence is followed all the way to its conclusion. And one where no final answer is written until the facts themselves are genuinely ready to support it. That is the entire ask. Even after everything the independent autopsy revealed, this case still rests on a foundation with real significant gaps. And those gaps are the reason nothing here can truthfully be called finished. The first gap is toxicology. As of tonight, no toxicology results have been made public, not from the family's independent examination, and not from the state of Mississippi. That absence matters more than it might initially appear. Toxicology is often the piece of an investigation capable of either ruling a possibility out entirely or confirming exactly what a family has quietly feared from the beginning. Without it, an entire category of questions remains suspended and unanswered. Outside a small circle of investigators, no one knows what that report will eventually reveal. And until it is released, this case cannot move forward the way it needs to. The second gap belongs to the state of Mississippi itself. Long before Nolan's family sought a second opinion, the state's own medical examiner completed the very first examination of his body, the earliest possible look, closest in time to whatever happened on that island. Those original findings have never been made public. No official report shared, no summary offered to the press, no word on what was actually observed in those first hours after Nolan was found. That silence has not gone unnoticed and has not gone unquestioned, because somewhere inside a file that has not yet been opened to the public may sit the very details capable of answering what the independent examination, through no fault of its own, simply could not. And then there is the third gap, the one that sits underneath every other question in this entire case, the one that more than any other single detail could ultimately change the full understanding of what took place that day. What condition was Nolan actually in the moment he entered the water? Was he fully aware of what was happening around him? Investigators have indicated in careful language that this single detail may be the most important piece of the entire case, more significant in some real sense than any individual physical finding recovered afterward. Because everything else, every documented result, every unanswered question so far ultimately circles back to this one specific moment. And right now, no one has that answer. Not the family, not their independent examiner, not the public that has spent weeks following every update in this story. 3 gaps. 3 reasons this case remains officially open. 3 questions standing directly between what is known today and what actually happened to Nolan Wells on a day that was supposed to be nothing more than an ordinary summer afternoon on the water with friends. This is not the end of Nolan's story. If anything, tonight is closer to the midpoint. The full truth in cases like this one rarely arrives all at once. It comes in pieces, released slowly, sometimes reluctantly, often only after enough attention and enough people refusing to look away has made it impossible for that truth to stay buried any longer. Behind every one of these unanswered questions is a family that has to keep living every single day inside the space those questions leave behind. A mother who wakes up each morning still without the answer she has been asking for since the very beginning. A father carrying a grief the rest of the world only glimpses in brief moments at press conferences and in short public statements, while the quiet, private weight of it never actually leaves him. And an 18-year-old whose story is still being written by other people simply because he is no longer here to finish telling it himself. Cause and manner of death, undetermined. Not because nothing happened. Not because no one is looking or asking the right questions. Because there is still, even now, Too much missing to say with any real certainty what happened on that island on the 4th of July. Nolan Wells deserves a complete answer. His family has been asking for one since the first day. And until the toxicology is released, until the state's original findings are made public, and until the question of what condition Nolan was in when he entered that water is finally answered, this case remains exactly where it has been since it began. Open, unresolved, and waiting for the truth.